Not true. Okay. Yeah. No, we did not cheer avidly for the Fighting Irish. In fact, I never. Who did we go to? I went to one game in the 4 years I was there. Yeah. Okay. Tonight, Lewis on the rising and dying self. And because I know some of you out there, I got more comments about, it was actually last week was the most intelligible thing I've ever said, standing up here. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Yeah, what you used, those talks in the past were just over everybody's head. They didn't understand. I said, okay. So I'll try tonight. And some of the stuff we've gone over in the past, and maybe it'll be a little more down to earth. But I thought I'd start out. I was also told they liked me reading Lewis, so I said, okay, I'll read some more Lewis. So in his book, Surprised by Joy, which is an autobiography of his early life up until he becomes a theist, comes to believe in God. So it goes up roughly till around 1929. And he says this about himself as a schoolboy. He says, I was presented with a mass of religious ideas, and all teachers and editors took it for granted from the outset that these religious ideas were sheer illusion. No one ever attempted to show in what sense Christianity fulfilled paganism or paganism prefigured Christianity. The accepted position seemed to be that religions were normally a mere confused mixture or hodgepodge of nonsense, though our own, by a fortunate exception, was exactly true. But the impression I got was that religion in general, though utterly false, was a natural growth, a kind of endemic nonsense into which humanity tended to blunder. In the midst of 1,000 such religions stood our own, the 1,001st, labeled true. But on what grounds could I believe this exception? It obviously was, in some general sense, the same kind of thing as all the rest. Why was it so differently treated? Now, last week I went over Lewis, how he was concerned with how things make sense, how they fit together. And he believed, I read last week, that all of us are concerned about how things fit together, how they make sense, so that we all approach life trying to make sense out of things. And so he was trying to make sense out of the idea of the dying and rising God myth, as he calls it, which, according to Christians, became a fact in Jesus Christ. And we saw how Lewis tried to make sense out of it because he found this idea present in pagan myths in some form. And then he also appealed to the agricultural seasons, how things die and then rise again. And right now they are rising as we speak here tonight. And then he appealed to, as background to Christianity, he said the similarities in morality that Christianity has with non-Christian religions and atheism. And then I'll quote again something I said last week. He wrote, "We must not be nervous about parallels in pagan Christ. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. Given that there are parallel, dying and rising gods in other religions, it should be made clear that we are not pronouncing all other religions to be totally false, but rather saying that in Christ, whatever is true is consummation and perfection, what you find in other religions. My conversion very largely depended on recognizing Christianity as the completion and actualization of something that had never been wholly absent from the mind of man. Now, in the end, Lewis thought there was one reason to treat Christianity differently in the sense that he believed the myth became fact. Never ceased to be myth in the sense that it was a story or a narrative about gods, but in this case, the God actually came into human history and died, was crucified, and rose again. Now, this week's talk is hopefully about what role did the idea of the rising and dying, the dying and rising self play in Lewis's coming to accept the Christian religion. He wrote, and here again I'm quoting, "In the pagan myths of rising and dying gods, the strong, if the half-articulate feeling that man himself must undergo some sort of death if he's truly to live." So again, he says, in the pagan myths of rising and dying gods, the strong, if half-articulate feeling that man himself must undergo some sort of death. So in other words, Lewis thinks there's some sense in all these religions that we ourselves must die if we are going to truly live. And to make sense out of this, very briefly, this is some of the stuff I went over in the past couple of years, and I've been told nobody understood what in the world we were talking about. But you have to remember, Lewis thinks just as ordinary people believe in morality, it's shared universally, just as ordinary people believe in the idea of dying and rising God idea. Lewis was absolutely convinced that ordinary people believe in a soul-body distinction, so that in the background now of the rising and dying self idea is the idea that we ourselves are souls. We are not bodies. And we can survive death and potentially exist forever. The idea of a soul-body distinction is not a strictly religious idea. My students over and over again would always say to me, well, people believe in the soul because they believe in God. Lewis, no. People believe in God because they believe in the soul. I won't go off on this, seriously, I won't, but there was a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal about, 10 days ago. My friend Gardner over here, I immediately sent it to Gardner and says, look, get a load of this. An evolutionary biologist named Jerry Coyne, C-O-I-N-E. You can go Google him. He taught at the University of Chicago for years. He recently resigned from a group that basically was an atheistic group. He's an thoroughgoing atheist for the promotion of science. And he resigned from the group because he resigned along with Richard Dawkins. I don't know if you've ever heard of Richard Dawkins. He's at Oxford, been there for years. He's retired. And then there's a guy named Steven Pinker up at Harvard in the psychology department up at Harvard. These three guys, they all, in unison, just resigned within the last 10 days from this atheistic religious group because they said it become woke. And they wanted to have nothing to do with this wokeism because the wokeism was based in mind-body dualism. Now, so far as I know, wokeism is not a calling card of most religious groups. In fact, most of these people would think they are atheistically inclined. Coyne said the basis of this atheistic scientific group going woke was its affirmation of mind-body dualism. So, read between the lines, Coyne was saying these atheists are promoting what they're promoting because they believe in a soul-body distinction. Not because they believe in God, but because they believe in the soul-body distinction. And I always tell my students, no. People don't believe in the soul because they believe in God. They believe in God because they believe in the soul. And that was Lewis's view. So you have to have this soul-body distinction in the back of your mind to understand the dying and rising self. What then about this idea appealed to Lewis? He says there are wrong ways to develop it that we find in the history of the world. And he thought Buddhism was an example of, and I read this last week, I'm going to read it again. He thought Buddhism was an example of the dying and rising self idea, but it was the dying of the self in Buddhism was equated with or parsed out in terms of the non-existence of the self. And Lewis said, I just can't believe the idea of the self dying is really the self not existing at all. So I'll just read it again. Thanks for the gospel of Buddha, as he's writing this to a university friend. Insofar as it's a gospel, an exposition of ethics, etc., it has not added much to what I know of the subject, though it's been very pleasant reading. On the metaphysical presuppositions of Buddhism, it's given me new light I did not realize before. The Buddha's denial of the Atman, that's the soul. That's very interesting. I can't at present believe it. To me, the self, as really existing, seems involved in everything we think. Indeed, Buddhism itself does not seem to make much sense or much use of the non-Atman doctrine once it's been stated. It is only by torture that the theory of rebirth is made comprehensible by denying the non-Atman. So the soul must exist if you're going to make sense out of rebirth. And although I sometimes feel that complete abnegation is the only real refuge, in my healthier moments, I hope that there's something better. This minute I can pine for nirvana. Nirvana means nothingness. But when the sky clears, I shall prefer something with more positive joy. Now, Lewis told his friend who sent him this book that, in his darker moments of life are when things aren't going well, when you're depressed, when you're discouraged. Lewis says, I can understand in those moments, I yearn for nothingness. I wish I did not exist. But in better moments, when the sky is cleared, he longed for something, he said, more positive than nothingness. And he believed all of us yearn for something more positive in nature. And he believed this because he believed all of us want to experience pleasure. And pleasure makes up what we think of as happiness. And he wrote this in a letter to someone. The normal value judgment of all unsophisticated people is that pleasure is good. So again, he's appealing to ordinary people. The ordinary judgment of anyone is that pleasure is good. I know in the group that meets, I don't know what to call it here, Father Tim, between the 8 o'clock service and the 10 o'clock service. I know you've been going over English divines, and Lewis was, this loved to read, Richard Hooker. And here's what, I got my Hooker off the shelf. And I said, oh, I need to throw in a quote by Hooker. Hooker, quote, recognized that our natural tendency is to avoid the painful and seek the pleasant. That's Hooker. Normal tendency is to avoid pain and to seek pleasure. Aristotle, not a Christian, lives long before Jesus walks the earth. Aristotle, we have this expression, the hoi polloi, that just means the many. Everyone said Aristotle when he starts out his book called, fancy title, Nicomachean Ethics. He starts it out and he says, happiness, well-being is what we all desire. What is it though? And he said, the ordinary people, first thing they think of when they think of happiness is pleasure. Now, Lewis believed that God created us for a purpose, and the purpose for which we are created is to be perfectly happy. Now, that strikes the modern person, I think, people sitting here tonight. It strikes them as weird. Lewis thought the purpose for which God created us was to be happy, perfectly happy. Yeah, that's exactly what he said. I'm not going to read it tonight, the quotes, I could. Instead, I thought I would read you a little from another Wall Street Journal. This is a book review called Repelled by Liberty. It's by the son of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And the person writing the review, I'll just read this paragraph to you. It's interesting. I always get my journal, it's supposed to be on Saturday, Sunday. I always get it on Monday because the postman can't deliver it seemingly on time on Saturday. But here's the quote. In the speeches collected in this volume, Solzhenitsyn similarly bemoaned what he calls the ruinous tilt of the late Enlightenment and excoriated the godless humanistic individualism, liberalism, and rationalism of the philosophers and their ilk for elevating man, with a capital M, as the measurement of all things and the crowning glory of the universe. Solzhenitsyn blamed, quote, the ossified formulas of the Enlightenment and the tide of secularism they precipitated for making human happiness the central purpose of existence. Now, these Russian writers, Tolstoy's, these people, they tend to have a pretty bleak view of human existence. And here's Solzhenitsyn coming out of Russia. He comes to the States, and he's just going after the Enlightenment for the idea that they make human happiness the central purpose of existence, and the loss, he says, of accountability to God and society. Well, I don't know. If Lewis, it would have been fascinating to listen to Lewis and Solzhenitsyn. Now, Lewis would have said, no, Alexander. The idea that we're created to be perfectly happy is not a product of the Enlightenment. This idea has its roots in the Christian church. It has its roots in Aristotle. It goes all the way back. It's not something that was cooked up in the Enlightenment. Okay, so Lewis believed pleasure's good, intrinsically good, he said, and we're created to experience perfect happiness. And we find ourselves thereby, he says, with the problem of pride, which he thought constituted the idea of the fall in Christian thought. Now just read, this is again Lewis. The fall in Christian doctrine is in fact pride. The moment you have a self at all, remember now he believes in the self, he's not a Buddhist. Buddha says there is no self. Lewis says the moment you have a self at all, there is a possibility of putting yourself first, wanting to be the center, wanting to be God. In fact, what Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods, could set up on their own, as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empire, slavery, the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God to provide him with the with the pleasure that will make him happy, to supply the pleasure that he desires. So Lewis believes it's precisely because there is something good to be had, namely experiences of pleasure. They're good. My students used to just almost univocally always say, there's nothing good. Nothing good. And I said, really? I'm trying to engage them. Nothing good? Nothing good. You know, what she says is good, he says is bad, nothing good. Lewis is of the school of thought, no, we all know pleasure is good. Indeed, it's because we know that we find the source of all disagreements, conflicts, because people are trying to get their proverbial hands on what's good. If they didn't believe there was something good, we wouldn't have all this conflict. So again, Lewis thinks the ordinary person knows that there's good out there, and they want it. Now, Lewis maintained that while every pleasure is a foretaste of the end for which we are created, the fruition of God, every pleasure is not here and now the road to that fruition. So in other words, just because pleasure is good, it doesn't follow from that we're entitled to experience every pleasure that was possible to experience. We have morality. To die to yourself is to acknowledge the claim of morality on your life, thought Lewis, and to say, I won't pursue pleasure right now because of moral restrictions, is to die to yourself and say, no, I will not. And Lewis said this choice itself, not to pursue pleasure, to obey the principles of morality, he said it itself is painful. He quoted John Henry Newman. We are, as John Henry Newman said, rebels who must lay down our arms to render back the will which we have so long claimed for our own. It is in itself, whenever and however it's done, a grievous pain. There's one right act, that of self-surrender, that's death to self, which cannot be willed to the height by fallen creatures unless it's unpleasant. So Lewis's view is, we know of the need to die to ourselves, but we fully recognize that the very choice to die to self is itself painful, because it's to say, I won't pursue my happiness on my own terms. I won't pursue happiness on my own terms. He wrote, "This is the ultimate law that the seed dies to live. The bread must be cast upon the waters. He that loses his life will save it. And a crucifixion of the natural self is the passport to everlasting life." In terms of the happiness, the proper good of a creature is to surrender itself to its creator. I'm still reading Lewis to you. When it does so, it becomes, in the end, good and happy, because God designed the human machine to run on himself. That's why it's just no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. So in Lewis's view, we're created for perfect happiness. The problem of mankind is we all know that. Implicitly, we all know it. And in this world, sin, in theological terms, immorality, in philosophical terms, is the choice to make ourselves happy, to try to make ourselves happy on our own terms. Not fully understanding, thought Lewis, that by doing that, you will never become perfectly happy. It's impossible, because God created us such that the happiness for which we're created is only gettable. It's only experienceable if you're willing to renounce your pursuit of that happiness. If you're not willing to renounce your pursuit of that happiness on your own terms, you will never get the happiness that you actually desire. So that you have to die to yourself in order to rise, in order to experience the happiness for which you're created. Now, for Lewis, again, now I'm going to close. Lewis thought this is a universal law. It's writ large across the planet. You can't get the happiness that you desire by trying to make yourself happy on your own terms. And he thought that truth was itself a background assumption in trying to understand the idea of the dying and rising God. Because if God is going to become completely human, God will have to die and rise again, because that's part of what the human nature, the human being must do in order to experience the happiness for which it is created. So as bizarre as it might sound in Lewis's view, the dying and rising self is a principle grounded in the idea of happiness, and that you will never get the happiness you crave, which is perfect in nature. You'll never get the perfect happiness you want by thinking you're going to do it on your own terms. It's a gift. It's not something you'll ever get on your own. And theologically, down through the ages, that's kind of become the idea. It's not something you can earn. It's not something you can work for. It's nothing but a gift in the end. So, any questions? I wasn't going to take any questions last week because there was food down there. And then Father Tim, he said he had a question. So I better take the question. You always have a question. No, it's perfect happiness is never to be had in this life. We live in the vale of tears in this life. Some of us are more fortunate than others in certain circumstances we're in. It's all a matter of, in some sense, on Lewis's view, just where you happen to be born or whatever. I don't know what you mean by metaphorical. The choice to die to yourself and not pursue happiness on your own terms, that's real. That's something every one of us has to wrestle with, to do. And he's not talking about committing suicide, if that's what you're...
doing something within your earthly existence, like making some profound change in your life without...
Oh, if you die to self, yeah, that's going to be a profound change in your life, because you're going to renounce the pursuit of happiness on your own terms. You're going to say, I will abide by the moral principles which I believe are true. And that's real. And, and theologically, you think of the book of James, somebody says, I believe this or that, and they just go on living the way they're living. There's no change. It's empty. So no, it has real consequences. We were just talking before coming up to the talk. I didn't know this, but Bonhoeffer died 80 years ago to the day, correct? And Bonhoeffer was in the States. He was teaching up at the Union Theological Seminary, right? And I don't know a lot about Bonhoeffer. I know the sketches of it. But anyway, he decided, I would take it for moral reasons, he had to go back to Germany. And so he left the U.S. and went back to Germany. Now, for those of you who don't know Bonhoeffer, this is in the late 1930s with Hitler's rise in Germany. Bonhoeffer's a German. He's teaching here in the States. And he thinks he's morally required. He has to go back. And in the end, it ended, it brought an end to his life. He was killed. So no, these are real issues, Lewis thinks. And, he says explicitly, there's a nice book of essays that was put together that, Lewis wrote. It's in one book called Christian Reflections. You get down to the end of the book, and he says in his last essay there, he came to Christianity having already made the decision to die to self. Yes. Yeah. You are always granted one question. Yeah.
That's based on the premise that you truly believe to give yourself to God to receive that gift.
Yeah, if you're talking about now, why he becomes Christian, yeah. So he believes he has to truly give himself, in your language, to God if he's ever going to be perfectly happy, because he can't make him. He thinks long and hard about this, that he cannot make himself perfectly happy.
The gift can only come to you based on
A choice you're making to receive it as a gift, basically. I mean, Lewis read widely. I mean, he puts us all to shame. He read so widely. He read John Stuart Mill. I don't know how many of you are familiar with John Stuart Mill. He was a well-known 19th century political activist in England. And Mill had a mental breakdown when he was about 20. His father had him learning Greek and Latin, I believe, when he was about 3 years old. His father was pounding this stuff into his head, and he had a mental breakdown. But he was famous for in the end promoting what's called utilitarianism, which is the idea that there are versions of utilitarianism, but basically one of the fundamental principles of utilitarianism is that pleasure is good and it constitutes happiness. But Mill, in his autobiography, if you want to it's one of the most interesting things to do if you like to read, is read autobiographies. And Mill has an autobiography, and Mill says in there, it finally dawned on him that the only way to become happy was to stop seeking happiness. This really resonated with Lewis. Every time you're trying to bring something about yourself, he thought this was he thought in a way, it was a universal law. You send your kids to school, you think you're going to give them a great education, they end up not being interested in using their education for anything whatsoever. You think you're going to make them Christians by sending them to Christian schools. They end up rebelling against Christianity. You think your wedding night, he says, is going to, you work so hard to make this the greatest night in your life, and it turns out to be the most miserable night in your life. He says, you can't wait to see your old friends. And then when you get there, you don't know what to say to your old friends. He says, there's this principle, it's at work in our world, and Mill thought pretty much the same thing, that the more you make happiness your objective, the further you're going to be from happiness. And hence, the only way you're going to get it in the end was the kind for which you're created, perfect happiness. The only way you're going to get it is to die to yourself. And hence, when we look up here and we see a cross, the idea you've got to die, Lewis he thought that had roots in what we all know about ourselves as human beings. Oh, Gardner. Yeah.
What did Lewis, when you talk about it, I'm not entirely sure.
You always say that. I don't know if I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Do you think that perfect happiness was attainable in this life?
No.
Okay, so
We're trying to get there, but we're never going to succeed.
and what keeps us from getting that perfect happiness is this is a choice, A or B. That our search is always tainted by self, or that no matter what we do, even if we live a perfect life as a monastery or something like that, it just isn't there. I mean, is it not available to us? Is it
No.
only available? In other words,
This is the fall. This is pride. It's not attainable in this life. You will never get it on your own. I think Lewis did believe in the idea of a real fall. He doesn't know when it actually occurred, what the circumstances were. In his book, The Problem of Pain, he says he's going to kind of tell a Platonic myth about this to try and make sense out of it. But we live in a world. So even if Gardner, and you more than anybody else comes closest to this in my life, dying to self, okay? Your problem is you got all these other people out here that have not died to self to the extent that you've died to yourself. And so that even if Lewis thinks it's ludicrous to take this seriously, but even if you were to completely die to yourself in this life, there's so many other people around you that are just going to make life miserable for you that it's not attainable in this life. But nevertheless, when it comes to happiness, we are perfectionists. We want to maximize our happiness. Nobody wants to be told, don't. Because they're in principle, they're maximizers. They want it and they want it now. I have 2 grandkids. The number of times, you have grandkids, the number of times these little kids, no, you can't have that now, but I want it now. Why does the little kid want it now? Because now here's Lewis's view, it's good. And you want as much of what's good as you can get. You're going to be a maximizer of it. If you're going to die to it, it's going to be painful. But that's what morality requires of us. Morality in Lewis's view is basically, no, I'm not going to try and maximize my happiness on my own terms. Now, I didn't read one quote. I should. My wife infallibly will always say, but you didn't make this point. Okay, well, no, I'm going to make this point. This comes in his essay, The Weight of Glory. And we'll get up there down there, wherever we're going for the food. This is written at the outset of World War II. If you ask 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues, 19 would reply, unselfishness. But if you had asked almost any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied, love. You see what has happened. A negative term, unselfishness, has been substituted for a positive, love. And this is of more than philological importance. The negative idea of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not primarily of securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. Now notice what he says. Their happiness is the important point. I do not think this is the Christian virtue of love. The New Testament has lots to say about self-denial, about death to self, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. So, morality, dying to self, you're not dying to self just to die to self. You die to self because your actions have effects on other people. When you seek to get happiness on your own terms, you are going to make other people unhappy. You're going to make their lives miserable. You're going to hurt them. You're going to harm them. So that Lewis thought love, he's got a book called The Four Loves. When he comes to the idea of charity, the fourth love, in the Greek it's called agape love. Lewis thought what's interesting about this is this type of love is not a feeling, it's an action. It's based in a choice. And what you're doing is you're dying to yourself, saying, no, I won't do it this way. Not just not to do it that way, but because you're concerned about, he says, the happiness of other people. And when you act immorally, when you break the moral law, when you sin in theological jargon, what you do has very serious consequences for other people. Yeah. Yes. You're here tonight because this is making you happy. No, very happy. Yes. No, Lewis thought there is happiness to be had in this life. Why? Because we all experience pleasure. We all want to experience more pleasure and less pain, but we all experience, to some degree, happiness in this life, and we should not be ashamed, on Lewis's view, of experiencing happiness in this life. As long as it's done, it's received in the proper way. He liked the idea when Jesus, first miracles performed at Cana in Galilee. It's a wedding. It's a celebration. And Lewis thought, we take with the gift of happiness in this life, and we give thanks for it. I didn't read this, but I mean, this is interesting. One of his closest friends, if not his closest friend, while his first 20 years in Oxford as a prof there, a don, his closest friend was J.R.R. Tolkien. And when my wife and I go to Oxford, we've been going every year for 8 years. We postponed it this year to go in. I saw your hand. I'll get your question. And we're going to probably go in January this coming year. But last year they had a whole series of talks on Tolkien. And the first talk we went to was given by the second in command of the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. And he put up on the screen, he said this was going to be the quote or the statement from Tolkien around which he was going to build the talk. And I'll never forget, Carolyn, she jabbed me, and she said, you better write that one down. And the talk was about Tolkien's interest in inventing words. Tolkien's interest in inventing words in the Lord of the Rings. He's got this language, and Tolkien was a guy, as it turns out, loved to play with words. So here was the quote around which the talk was built. Tolkien wrote about his interest in the invention of words, that, quote, "It must be emphasized that this process of invention is a private enterprise undertaken to give pleasure to myself. By giving expression to my personal linguistic, aesthetic, or taste." Why did Tolkien do this? He said, I did it because of the pleasure it gave to myself. And that was the view of Lewis. We do things in life, as long as they're morally permissible, you're going to do them because they give you pleasure. And I could go on and read Tolkien further to you about, he gave his inaugural lecture. He held a chair in Oxford. He gave his inaugural lecture on his day of retiring. And he describes how fortunate he's been to have been able to spend his life doing something which gave him great pleasure. So, great. Is long. Comes as a gift. Yeah. All of life is a gift on the views of these guys. God's created us, if we're serious, if we're not just being metaphorical, if we're serious. We all know we could go out of existence right now in this world. I've been in church in a service, somebody drops dead in service. I mean, all of us, just living right now is a gift, and the happiness that we experience is a gift. Yes, sir, you've been so patient.